The use of computer-generated images has become a staple for the film industry to create visuals that would be very hard to create in real life. The groundbreaking film, Avatar, commonly comes to mind in the discussion on CGI in movies due to the film's reliance on digital effects to create the vast majority of environments and characters. The positive audience and critical response to Avatar proved to the film industry that CGI was an effective replacement for real-life practical effects that had been used prior to these technological advances. Nowadays, it is extremely common for fantasy and action films to turn to CG effects to create what might have been laborious and time-consuming otherwise. But is the switch to digital better? As some film critics and myself would argue, the authenticity of practical effects beats those made via computer. The most important aspect of a film is audience believability, sometimes called reality status. The majority of the time, practical effects allows for a higher sense of believability and a stronger emotional response. In other words, it feels more real when it is real. Authors Joseph and Barbara Anderson theorize that if the overall activation level of our emotional system exceeds a certain threshold, then an appropriate emotional response is generated. If we recognize a sci-fi horror sequence as having a low reality status, or lower believability, then we inhibit our emotion system. Since a key part of making films is to get audiences to become emotionally invested in the work, establishing a higher emotional connection to a film is important to filmmaking. A great example of how practical effects outperform computer-generated effects to elicit an emotional response is to look at the Lord of the Rings trilogy in comparison to the Hobbit trilogy, all directed by Peter Jackson and created by his team of filmmakers at Weta Workshops in New Zealand. While the Lord of the Rings trilogy was made in the early 2000s and the Hobbit trilogy starting in 2012, many people prefer the look of the original trilogy over the newer trilogy because of the Hobbit's oversaturation of CGI. The older trilogy looks more realistic since the newer trilogy highlights and brings attention to its reliance on CGI, and therefore more people are more emotionally connected to the original trilogy. Let's take a look at some differences between the two. The original Lord of the Rings trilogy utilized many innovative and unique practical effects to achieve the magical look of Middle-earth. The pinnacle action sequence in the second Lord of the Rings movie is the Battle of Helm's Deep. In the books, the Battle of Helm's Deep described over 26,000 warriors between the two sides. In order to visually achieve this number of warriors, the Lord of the Rings production hired over 20,000 extras over the span of a 120-day shoot schedule who were featured in the battle. We see the opposite in the Battle of Five Armies in The Hobbit, which features a 100,000-person digital army. In the newer trilogy, all of the warriors look exactly the same, and the individuality of how a real army might appear is lost. In the article mentioned in the introduction, Joseph and Barbara Anderson discussed the reality status of films, saying, "Social psychologists assume that we must have the feeling of being in the presence of an actual person in order for that person to have an influence on our thoughts and feelings." The threshold model of social influence, proposed by psychologist Jim Balskovich, argues that when behavioral realism, or perceiving something as behaving in a realistic fashion, of someone is high, then social influence will occur. The digitally made warriors in the Battle of the Five Armies appear stiff and don't carry the same weight that a real person would. Analyzing their movements, we as an audience are able to see that they are digital. Therefore, according to the threshold model of social influence, watching the scene in the film is less emotionally stimulating than when watching the extras perform in the original trilogy battle. Another aspect to the Lord of the Rings films that appear more realistic were the scaled-down models of Middle-earth used in the original trilogy. Numerous fully detailed models of locations were brought to life by a skilled group of miniature artists. The larger models were called bigatures due to their enormous size. The bigature for Minas Tirith was 23 feet tall and was as tall as the room it was built in. In total, 64 miniature and bigature models were made for the three films, some sets being made multiple times in differently scaled sizes. The final products of these models are incredible. The locations appear extremely realistic, authentic, and magical. Many people argue that the use of these models contributed to Middle-earth feeling like a real place on screen. However, in the Hobbit trilogy, some Middle-earth locations were made via CGI. For example, the Misty Mountain, the final destination for the third film, was made digitally. The computer-generated lighting, shadows, landscaping, and colors are not 100% perfect, so when you notice mistakes in these elements, the film loses its believability. Joseph and Barbara Anderson call these mistakes CGI markers, or evidence of digital images, and their research shows that a high saturation of markers leads to a low believability. In turn, your emotional responses to the images diminishes. So, is the switch to digital better? If you admire and appreciate the hard work that comes from practical effects and their triggering of an emotional response, then I would say no, it is not better. While it was once hard for us to distinguish between what is CGI and what was real, we as consumers are beginning to recognize these differences more easily. With the current increased use of CGI in films, this negatively impacts our emotional reaction to the films and our overall experience. So if it is possible to create the visual effects in real life, then that will serve more effective for the audience. The Hobbit trilogy serves as a reminder that just because you can use CGI doesn't mean you should use it.